Okay, guys, Jeremy, if you want to run the video.
It starts with an idea to create something that has never existed and boldly go where no human has gone. But bold ideas are more than just words. They are a nation not starving during a global pandemic. They are a family spending more happy moments together. They are the desire to create a better tomorrow. And data is the breath that brings these bold ideas to life. Boldly go on your data journey. Caserta will help you get there.
Yeah, good morning and welcome to the 16th Annual MIT CDOIQ Symposium, Day 3, and you're on Track 1, the Environment, Social and Governance track, where we provide better data insights, enabling companies' ESG goals to ultimately benefit society. And just by the way, Danny, that was an awesome video you guys did, so congratulations on that. I'm your track producer, Robert Ludden, Vice President, Santos Consultants, and I'd like to welcome you to this outstanding session of Overcoming Regulated Industry Data Challenges to Drive Value. Now, before I introduce Danny and he can introduce his team, I'd like to just mention just a few housekeeping notes. If you've been with us already, you know this session is being recorded. A presentation will be made available to symposium attendees that are included in your registration, no charge. Video recordings will be uploaded to our CDOIQ YouTube channel 3 months after this event. We will, for our audience here live, have a Q&A at the end. So there are mics on either side. If you want to stick up your hand, please ask your question. But also for our virtual audience, we'll be monitoring the Q&A. So please feel free to enter any questions into the Q&A chat. We'll be monitoring that. So with that, I'd like to introduce Danny Siegel, who's the COO of Caserta. And Danny, I understand you'll be introducing your panel.
I will. Thank you very much, Robert. And thanks, welcome everybody. I congratulate you on being the stalwarts that hung around for the waning sessions here of the conference. I think we're going to make it worth your time. I'm grateful you stuck around, and this discussion topic hopefully will provide you a really informative and lively discussion around extracting value and some of the hurdles that regulated industries can get in the way of delivering that value. Let me first start with some introductions. So as Robert said, I'm Danny Siegel, COO, former COO, I should say, of Caserta. So I'll be your moderator. I'm a little bit about my background. I started my career as a data scientist. I'm a former chief data officer myself in consumer products. Most recently, of course, led the consulting practice at Caserta, and as of about, 6 weeks ago, we became part of the digital and analytics practice at McKinsey & Company. So our panel today is made up of, it's really kind of exciting. We have, I think, kind of the three, really, it would be two bookends. I was going to say bookends is a bad analogy, but kind of I think, representation for three of some of the most regulated industries you could come across. Some of the most challenging environments, namely insurance, healthcare, and financial services, and as it relates to regulation. So some quick intros of the people to my right here. So immediately to my right, Jesse Santos. Jesse's currently managing director at State Street. His career spans 15 years with financial services leaders such as BNY Mellon and Morgan Stanley. He has broad experience across all layers of the investment management industry, from front, middle to back office. And Jesse's previously served as director, head of data analytics and BI at BNY Mellon. Sitting to Jesse's right is Ranjana Young. Ranjana is a data and analytics strategist with Caserta, now of course McKinsey & Company, helping clients meet their business outcomes by leveraging digital data and analytics capabilities. Ranjana has about 20 years of experience in financial services, healthcare, having served as a chief data and analytics officer. She has vast experience in delivering data and analytics strategies, master data management solutions, data governance and quality solutions, data platforms to support transformations and monetize data assets. Prior to Caserta, she was the CDO at Northern Trust, head of data analytics and insights for Charles Schwab Investment Management, and most recently, chief data officer of Cardinal Health. And she is on the board of the EDM Council, as well as the Protham Chicago chapter, supporting educational and vocational programs for children in India and Mexico. welcome. And finally, to Ranjana's right is Srini Sankar. Srini is a visionary leader and data practitioner with a broad progressive experience in data strategy, analytics, and data science. Srini has demonstrated success guiding business transformation by leveraging mature, modern, emerging technologies. His areas of expertise include AI and machine learning, augmented analytics, data fabric, data mesh, blockchain, and cognitive systems. He's a frequent speaker at various CDO conferences, obviously. Lots of workshops and summits, and currently serves as enterprise data and analytics leader for the Hanover Insurance Group. So welcome, Srini. Thanks. So let me just start, now that we know each other, with a little bit of table setting. All of you, sort of as enterprise data practitioners, have witnessed this quickly and sometimes murky advance of regulation and compliance as it relates to data, right? This is kind of, it's a fact of life, but that coupled with the technology that's making it faster than ever to integrate and analyze that data, it presents a really challenging problem. So you have the responsibility to protect the legal, financial, reputational health of firms and clients. You also have to keep up with your consumers and that appetite for more insights, for more data, for more access, and you have to satiate that. So these two motivations, kind of on the surface, seem to be very divergent, right? But I want to challenge the panel today to share some nuggets of wisdom as to how these two demands actually can live in relative harmony. All right? And to do that, let's start off with some of, I think, probably the foundational question, really, which is, in your respective industries and experiences, what kinds of regulatory hurdles to sort of fluid data usage and exploitation have you experienced of late? And for this first one, I'll just start with you, Jesse.
Sure, absolutely. So State Street and the other firms that I've worked with are global custodian banks, first and foremost, and then have many services that roll off of that. So using State Street as the example, we have a global markets business. For the brokerage side, we have an investment management arm, and we have our investment services division. All three serve similar client bases for different reasons. And there's always a constant pull between them to see what they can get out of the other group, so just internally speaking. And so as you approach that problem set and the value of data that sits in each one, we have to work very methodically and with a lot of care on how we understand the questions that are coming from the various client bases. So one big example is from our investment services arm, we have the opportunity to present new products. One in particular is a benchmark, so benchmarking against investment decisions for our investment services clients. The bank and global markets both have a ton of information that can be served up in benchmark form. In order to go from banking data, transactional, client-specific, and then into global markets, which has prices, spreads, and that sort of thing, to move that data into a normalized view and then subsequently to hide all of the client-specific information, we have to go through a massive undertaking of going through each specific client, getting permission, understanding, and then explaining where the data is going to be, how it's going to be secured, how it's going to be masked. This whole process, we've been able to do a few of these projects over the last few years, but the coordination and the undertaking between the regulators, the clients, and our own internal IT department, data security, becomes an impediment to getting the benchmark actually built because of timing, right? Like a lot of these things are timing based. So what we've been really working on is trying to streamline those different avenues so that as an idea approaches and we want to monetize that, we can quickly sort of get through the check boxes to make sure we've got the proper inputs before the benchmark becomes obsolete. So that's one big example that we've encountered, and it's the solution to it, if we're going to get creative and start talking about how do we overcome these things, it's patience and it's diligence. There's really no magic bullet that I've found other than educating people, being responsive to any sort of question that comes up from the respective stakeholders, and then documenting and making the process repeatable. It's sort of as simple as that. Otherwise, you lose the opportunity.
Thanks, Jesse. And yeah, Ranjana, so I know you also have a wealth of expertise in the financial services and healthcare. What are the kinds of hurdles that you recognize?
So I think I'm going to build on the financial services
Totally fine.
one first. It's interesting, Jesse and I were talking just before this on, it was very interesting at Northern Trust. We did this exercise of, we actually took, there were about 4 regulations that we were initially serving. It was CCAR, Basel II, Basel III. You remember the days 10 years ago, right? 10, 12 years ago, maybe still now, and then there was the whole AML. And we just did this exercise of looking at the data inventory, looking at the mapping that's required, and took the business KPIs. There was about 98% overlap of what you were doing for the regulations that would truly impact the customer, impact the overall operations, the operational efficiency. We were having several, there was close to 90 different copies of product data that we had and asset data that we had. So you knew that you could actually get a lot of operational efficiency from that. So it was super eye-opening for the business leaders to see that, to say, hey, as you're truly, meeting all the regulations, you are laying the foundation to be a much more operationally efficient business, and you're running a better business. So I just wanted to kind of build on that. And to Jesse's point, there's no silver bullet. You have to be methodical about it. You have to build some of the key capabilities, whether it was the asset master data and others that are super required to kind of for the regulation, but also for all the business KPIs that needed to be there. And I'll take a healthcare example really quick. And I think you mentioned that a little bit around anonymizing information. So when we were doing some work within Cardinal around looking at the patient journey and having very, partnering with biopharma organizations to really have very targeted solutions for patients. We had data usage requirements, and every data usage requirement, we just didn't understand them really well. So it was really difficult. So we had all this data that we really couldn't unlock because we just didn't understand how did I truly unlock them. So it was pretty enormous exercise we had to go through to look at those usage requirements, figure out a way to look at that patient journey and see how could you truly unlock the value and as well. So,
and what was the role of regulation in those? Just on top of that,
so you have to, patient data is highly
regulated.
regulated. So you knew that you had to anonymize the patient data. You had 180 different copies of the patient data. So we knew we absolutely did not want to, so anonymizing that, but also seeing if you could create that patient 360 for that to make sure that we have, you're able to kind of really get, very, key solutions for realizing the patient outcomes. So that,
Very cool. Okay, thank you. And how about you, Srini?
Yeah. So like banking and investment management, right, like insurance is also very heavily regulated. It's not just a federal regulation, insurance body regulation, and being a public company, right, like many insurers are SOX regulated as well. And the interesting thing is like independent state regulations. So coming to the topic of data and regulation, right, like, so I'll give an example. The car insurers, right, like personal auto insurers, like I've started giving out the dongles to attach it to your car for tracking the driving behavior and predict based on your driving behavior and do the rating and premium based on how fast you drive, like are you hard stopping, hard accelerating, like are you within the speed limit? That is actually not possible, say, for example, in Massachusetts. You can actually track it, but you cannot make a customer pay additional premium just because like that customer is driving crazy in like I-93 or 128. So it's like that. And same way, right, like that same tracking many states are doing for what we call like mileage-based insurance, right? Like how much miles you drive and how efficiently and effectively you are driving, like you are priced like that. So Tesla is the latest example on that, right? Like truly data-driven insurance, but Tesla can't do that in Massachusetts, for example. So that's how heavily regulated insurance, right? Like so, I've gone through being in this role, like GDPR for a little while when we had the UK division. Then CCPA for the past, like, well before pandemic, we started working on it, and due to pandemic, like the California state pushed the certain key dates, but interestingly, like they kind of like gave some slack to the insurers because they said, right, like they were going after Facebook's, Twitter's of the world for the data, right, like PII data, not for the insurers for most part, but still regulation. And 18 to 20 states now are piggybacking on that CCPA. CCPA by far is the most stringent privacy regulation ever, more than GDPR. So CCPA took the GDPR and added so much. It's so stringent, like 18 to 20 states now said like, oh, let's just copycat that, piggyback on it. So it's coming. So now look at insurers, right? Like they have to follow all of that.
And it's not limited
every
to
individual
insurance.
state.
Like every consumer products company, anyone who has consumer data, period.
So it is like a lot of pressure, like a lot of oversight. And I just heard like, I still remember like one other example I'll tell and I stop. 5-6 years ago, as I said, like I've been speaking at the CDOs, other conferences, workshops, right? Sure. I had to use big data back then, but the regulators don't allow it. Back then, like they were telling, right, like, oh, no, we can't, our legal was telling, like, you cannot put big data on the slides, even internal presentations. So I had to like rename that to be like a data lake. So I prepared the presentation.
You had to rename the asset to make it work.
Yeah.
Well, that's creative. And I was actually going to flip the question a little bit. We talked, actually, Jesse touched on it already about a specific kind of monetization strategy that in one of your industries, and what sort of you had to do to make it work. Ranjana, I'll start with you just to mix up a little bit. Is there a specific example you can think of where there was something, you're really trying to do something creative with data and you had to overcome, and how you overcome that hurdle?
It was the same component, right? We have, at Cardinal, we had, as I mentioned, we had these data usage.
Right.
Clearly the data usage agreements, not understanding them really prohibited us from looking at truly, like we had hub services that we would partner with the biopharma organizations. We just couldn't extend some of that through the full patient journey because you could not access all the disorder, disease disorder information, the specialty information, and connect it to patient care. So it truly prohibited us from monetizing that capability, because you knew that if you unlocked it, the payers would benefit from it, and et cetera. So it really, you knew that for us, it was very prohibitive, right? You needed to kind of understand the usage requirements. So, I mean, it is, to his point too, right? I think there are some regulations where it just, you really can't. You
simply can't go there.
Really, it prohibits you from really actually delivering the full-blown value to even patients.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, so it's tough. Like I think what I was thinking was like, in those industries, were there ways where through things like anonymization, you could still garner some of the benefit, enable the business, yet, at least we keep going back to the customer or consumer example or patient example, still obfuscating that, but actually improving healthcare outcomes despite it.
There's definitely work that I know I did in the investment in financial services side for sure to kind of do that on the customer side, and again, to your point, it's very critical to understand that customer 360 and really understand what those experience metrics are and how do you make sure. I mean, there are certain states and regulate because of the regulatory GDPR really kind of puts the lockdown on certain personalization that you required, especially on the banking side.
Okay.
But I think there are ways to really anonymize that information and provide that.
I'll add,
Jesse, if you had any other
anytime there's
examples.
personally identifiable information, you're going to have to anonymize, and then it becomes that much harder to make the relationships, right? So in our industry, it's less about it's less about not being able to accomplish what your goal is, because our regulations, while they are heavy and they are complicated, they're not going to prevent us from doing something.
Yeah.
The only thing that prevents us from doing something is doing it in time to capture the value. So the limitations there, the limitations on the costs that we incur to stay within our regulations.
Okay.
That's another one. I mean, a lot of consultants, a lot of, and it's, these things tip the scales when you start talking about budget allocations and that sort of thing, right? So you got like certain budget to handle regulations. Then the business gets their allocations. And then the key is if they could work together, to your point, because so much of the data management and insights that you can gain from the regulatory projects can be used for the business projects.
Right.
So it becomes
That's the example you were going to
We
mention,
drove that. It was phenomenal to actually, at Cardinal, the chief, information security officer talked about it all the time, where she was like, gosh, don't think of me as someone that's coming in and putting the barriers up.
Yeah.
Look at, and we, was talking to Jesse about this, like we created a map that showed, every regulation and how some of the KPI mapping could occur. And she would be like, we're doing this, if we actually meet all the information security requirements, you'll actually do a better job of, managing your customer information.
That's very interesting.
Your patient information, your actual product information, et cetera. And it just naturally will, you're really improving the experience.
That's great. So it sort of flips the problem on its head,
Yeah.
which is if you work really hard to adhere to the governance or adhere to the regulation, that in fact it liberates your processes a bit. I did want to back up, and I'm sorry, I'll come back to you in a sec, Srini, but something Jesse said, like it's not so much that it's an impediment, is what you said. You've kind of grown used to it it's kind of a cost of doing business. For folks watching here in the room and listening, like what are some of the cost factors that you see as unique in a highly regulated industry like yours that are?
So the costs definitely come down to the accuracy, right? So in our industry, accuracy is key. And I've done a lot of chief data officer forums, and you speak with consumer good companies, and they're like, close enough, right? Like I get treated as like a female Latino most of the time in my in the marketing materials because of a female name, and so if they're off a little bit, so what? I get a handbag ad, right? But in our industry, the numbers have to be accurate to meet the regulations. So the costs really come with the accuracy. So you try to bring in the latest technology, you try to bring in the experts like Caserta and others to help with you. So those drive up the costs, and you're constantly trying to stay up on those things because you can't mess up, and you can't, the fees that come with it on the flip side justify the costs that we have to incur to meet the regulations. So that constant pull and tug, and it just comes down to the numbers have to be right. So Sometimes that's technology driven, hopefully most of the time, and that's what our jobs are, right? To introduce technology and processes that can regulate and speed up this process. But at the end of the day, sometimes it's people that we have to bring in to clean up all the things around the edges.
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Jesse said. I mean, to your point, like the whole data quality for accuracy rules, it's very complex rules that you create, and definitely in investment management, you don't have a choice. Like,
But
so
regardless
that
of industry,
cost-
that's good housekeeping
Absolutely.
for any of us, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think but it does add, especially the accuracy rules, because you're moving up the scale from a data quality dimension standpoint in terms of what it takes, right?
So that's kind of a nugget of wisdom. I think it's
Yes.
important to highlight that. So it's not that the regulation itself is a massive impediment. There are mechanisms,
correct.
ways, processes that
Yes.
both technically and governance have enabled us to get around them, to sort of continue to add the value. But in fact, it's made these industries better custodians of data, perhaps, and maybe even added value to the data in ways that I know from personal experience that when you don't focus on quality, we were talking about this in advance,
Yeah.
you're going to result in some bad decisions being made because you haven't focused on it. So it does prevent that. Srini, did you want to jump in? Sorry.
See, we've been talking about data monetization here at the MIT itself, right? Like for the past 4-5 years, at least 4 years now. This is what I tell, like, be it like banking, investment management, insurance, right? Like, I would say, like, we monetize everything, right? Like, so data is our core. The information, right? Like, we don't have manufacturing, we don't have a touch and feel product, like, we don't have any inventory, right? Like, everything is based on data, information, and using the data and information wisely, both like enterprise data as well as third-party external data, and making that key risk decisions that our actuaries, underwriters can use and fulfill a promise. So it's a promise that's made to the customer, right? Like, so in terms of, right, like, hey, when something bad happens, we are there for you. But as a business, like all insurers have to manage that effectively, top line, bottom line, like operational efficiencies, like expenses. It's all based on data.
Yeah.
So to me, right, like now in this conference also, like I started hearing about the level 5 maturity, like as data leaders and CDOs, we all know level 1 through level 5. Like now they are talking about level 5 maturity as data as an asset and putting data in the balance sheet,
Right.
in the asset, right? Like, to me, right, like, okay, insurers or heavily regulated industries, like, can they do it?
Well, I think it's not just a can. It is an interesting proposition, right? To get to that level, there's a maturity level from a technical perspective in governance, but like you said, getting to the point where the business recognizes an asset. I mean, we all know that to manage data, particularly in a regulated industry where you're actually having to double down and make it as accurate as Jesse was saying, is a massive investment that's often capitalized.
And we are already like monetizing, right?
You're monetizing it on the L part of the P&L.
Yeah.
But then actually making that migration, saying it is actually an asset that it needs to be maintained over time, just like a factory does, or a truck, or any other asset that a company builds. And I think that's probably making that flip is where, I mean, my impression, I'm not supposed to be part of the panel, but I'll offer my sort of observations is we're getting to that point where I think a lot of industries are starting to realize, and these industries probably are at the forefront because of regulation, that in fact the business is data. And therefore it's not such a leap to say it's
like,
something that should be valued.
In that example, right, like business is data, we say like insurers, I'm sure like banks also like work with a lot of the third-party data suppliers, right? Like, so I'll give an example, Verisk, for example, right? Data is their business. So they sell the data. CoreLogic sells insurers all the geo data.
Right.
So now they can actually, when they productize data, right? Like data as a product, data product. So if they have like a line item data product that they've been selling to 15 different insurers,
Sure.
now they can put that in the line item in the balance sheet, that how the P side of it, right?
Yeah.
So, but can a bank do it, or insurance do it?
Well, that's
or
an
even
interesting question,
healthcare?
right?
Yeah, that's an interesting. We certainly monetize once it becomes a product,
Yes.
right? But
Yes.
we amortize as the technology that supports it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Choice, right? So, yeah, it's one of those things where I think it comes down to, is the data part of technology or is the data a product?
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think on the custodial side too, pretty much it is, data is a product, right? To a great extent, given what we're providing to the customers. So I think, it was phenomenal to see at Northern, and I'm sure you've done some of that, Jesse, as well, as we were able to kind of really, as we were providing that capability to our customers, really provide data quality metrics as one of the service.
Yes,
So
service.
that they didn't have to build data teams to again review what was provided. So it was just a phenomenal partnership that we have with our customers to really use that as a key capability and a differentiator.
Let me pivot for a second. So I think it's interesting with where the conversation goes when you start talking about regulated data. But so thinking more organizationally, so highly regulated industries also tend to have a little bit of a what's the right word the nice way of putting it, kind of a look back culture, right? Very, very conservative because of the regulations, because it's almost forced upon them. How can you comment on how the culture in the organizations you've been part of has contributed to good or bad use of and management of data within these constraints?
I don't see culture as a hindrance to any of advancement in data, right? Like it's, to be frank, like it's always a regulation, right? Like so insurers, for example, if they are rolling out an product algorithm or efficiency optimization algorithm, right? Like it has to go through so much vetting with individual state regulators. So again, it's not just one regulator, right? So rolling it out like individual states, those individual state regulators have to look at the entire lineage of data to understand like where the data is coming from, like how the data is going through various hops, right? Like if it's getting to the staging, getting to the discovery platform, and if AI ML model is using that data set, trained data set, like model, and then they also have to like vet the deployment approach. So that data scientists are like way forward, right? Like in thinking, like they want to roll out so much, but they can't.
I have a question for the audience. So if you work at a regulated company, how many in the room have had a regulatory fine put down on their company? Not your fault. Right? So the history, and then they're all different, right? So I've been at Northern, BNY, State Street for various lengths of time and different reasons, but the history of each one of them dictates how conservative they are with certain pieces of data, right? So you can look this up on the internet. You don't have to. I don't have to say it out loud, but we have our own challenges based off of regulatory fines that we've come across in the past. And anytime you come up on that particular data domain to do something to bring it in to try to monetize it, you hit multiple barriers before you can get anywhere. It's insane. But that's the history, and sometimes you learn it the hard way by you stepping too far over one of those lines and someone comes at you. And sometimes you have to do it beforehand. But it definitely creates a different path you have to go to try to solve that problem. And that's one of the biggest things I think about the culture and the history, is just understanding what's happened in the past, what preventative measures they put in place now. and then you're going to have to tread lightly for some period of time before that's going to open up.
Yep. Talking about fines, sorry. No, one thing I wanted to mention about, like you can all Google, right? Like Google JPMC data quality, right? Like, so that's a biggest data specific fine that happened, right? It was a simple data quality check that JPMC failed to do upstream at the transactional trading system, cost them like millions and millions of dollars. Not now, right? This is even before GDPR days.
Yeah. Right.
I was just going to add one thing around culture. I, at least, was really fortunate to work with chief privacy officers, chief compliance officers, chief risk officers, and they, a lot of times, rotated into, they had business roles before, so a lot of times their goal was to really bring the chief data and analytics officers to the table, talk about how do we not just speak about this as a regulatory requirement, but talk about how do we really solve this. We are meeting the regulation, but we're actually solving a broader business issue with it, right? So we were always, I remember, conversations at pretty much in the last 3 roles that I've had at Cardinal, or at Northern, really talking about, hey, if we do the right thing and meeting all the commitments for AML regulation, we know we would have better customer data. We would actually implement the data quality capabilities that are truly required. We would actually have information to truly, change the way we engage with our customer as well, right? While we're meeting the regulations. I think, and of course, there's a whole, you talked about the fine, but there's such a huge brand and trust issue that creates
reputation
that it's hard to overcome that, right?
So in a sense, this goes back to what we were saying earlier, which is the regulation is not necessarily shouldn't be the motivator for being great data custodians, right? We want to be great data custodians because it's good for our businesses. Now, I don't want to minimize the complexity that and the overhead that regulations put on these industries, but ultimately the outcome for business could be positive. Which, let me, unless there was another comment on this, I wanted to switch a little bit. In your individual kind of roles, you're balancing the laundry and dishes of day-to-day managing technology, managing data governance processes and so forth, and at the same time having to constantly adjust to a shifting regulatory landscape. How do you balance those? Even just from a funding perspective, you're constantly chasing this, right? And it's not, you can't always predict it, right? So it doesn't live within a business cycle. It's whenever it wants to happen, right? How do you live with it?
As Ranjana said, right, fortunately we now have chief security officer, privacy officers, right? It's, to be frank, I'm actually working on one of the information protection governance and oversight, right? For all our BI scorecards and the data, augmented analytics pipeline, right? Fortunately, that budget is coming from the CISO budget, not my budget. So, to touch up on that, we have those roles now, right? I'm seeing, there are a few data officers who are also, owning up privacy officers and security officers, because part of it, they've come from some of the risk areas and security areas, and they own that. So I don't know, how they are going to balance it. Are they going to be more of a privacy, less of a data? Fortunately, I don't have to do it. I'm just data.
I think I'll speak a little bit about the balancing act, and I'm sure, Jesse, you have a lot to talk about there. I think to some extent, it's as a chief data analytics officer, our role is to really educate our businesses. If you're really meeting regulations, at least we did that at Northern, leverage CCAR, leverage AML to build our master data capabilities. At Schwab, we leveraged 2 key regulations to build our asset master. So you kind of have to really leverage, work with your risk and compliance officers, but also your true business leaders, whether it's head of equity or head of, to say, hey, there's components here where we will build a foundation that'll help you with business analytics as well. And I think I was fortunate enough to have those leaders understand the importance of that. Yes, there's a little bit more, the price is a little bit more than just meeting the regulation, but that gives you the foundation to lay the foundation for that.
There's always the balancing act. I've always been on the business side of data, not on the corporate regulatory side of it. But to your point, trying the leveraging of the budgets to drive both. So I've always tried to understand what our corporate chief data officer has been faced with from a regulatory perspective, and then so it's a give and take. So as a provider of technology, I've gone to that side of the business and said, hey, why not use some of our tools? We have tools in investment management. We have tools in our global markets business that we use for the business. And if you look at, again, how the budgets are allocated, sometimes our corporate data teams don't get the technology budgets because they're, it's more about the mapping. It's more about just get the report out. But so we do this where we try to participate as much as we can in sharing ideas. I know I've brought certain consulting firms specifically to the table for the corporate data side. So yeah, it's the balancing act comes down to build the relationships, offer something to the other side of the process, because everybody's always looking for, well, how is it going to benefit me?
Right.
Obviously, but like if we start trying to think of it as a mutual benefit, then chances are you get through some of these things.
It's interesting. You touched on something really interesting, especially if you do the business bag strategy and pulling together. At Schwab, we had done this whole map of when you look at performance reporting, or you look at benchmark information, 90% of that data was also required for 3 key regulations, right? To your point, right? I think all the performance, the mapping and showing that view to both your chief information security officer and also to your head of, equity and head of fixed income to say, hey, the data sets are the data sets.
It's interesting. Right? The CDO, there's 2 things there, right? You're mentioning like CDO as almost educator, as well as the CDO being somewhat the connective tissue from a data perspective, making sure that all the constituents in the business understand the benefit that their sort of mutual objectives
and also change agent, right?
Change
agent,
of course.
evangelist, advocate, you name it, right? Like it's all of the above.
Spend a lot of time in steering committees explaining.
Exactly.
This is the vision. This is how it's going to benefit you. This is how it's going to benefit you, and let's start to work together on it. Absolutely.
Let me pivot one last time here. We have just a few minutes left, and we're going to give just maybe 5-10 minutes at the end for some Q&A. If there's folks sitting here in the room, probably more online given the time of the timing of the conference. If you were sitting there listening to this conversation about compliance and how to handle it, and you're at an earlier stage of addressing these compliance issues, or I say an earlier stage, you might be a very mature company, but having addressed the issues through gum and duct tape and shoelaces and so forth, how would you start? Like, how would you start to change the mindset, start to be more aggressive, start to garner the right kind of investments, and start to capture the interests of the organization towards moving in this direction more aggressively?
So you want
Start
me
with
to
you, Srini. Yeah, take that.
Understand what the regulators are coming after, right? Like understanding, like I'm now actually reading one of the states' data, specific to data, like data management, they are bringing up the regulation. Gotta understand it, right? Like even before my role at Hanover, when I was a global data officer for financial services, I was managing 26 countries' data operations, where the data is moving from Eastern Europe, Latin America into like a US data warehouse. We've had like heavy regulations from even countries like, obviously like back then Russia, Nicaragua. So suddenly like they stop oh, we are not going to send data because our regulators did an audit, like we are going to stop. So I had to like go and ask them, okay, what's your policy procedure? Why are you stopping it? And then like understand that, dissect that, and then go and meet middle ground. So I would say like you have to start with understanding it. Like a lot of times when the regulators write, right, like they are not like data experts like us who are writing it, right? So they are lawyers. So there are gaps that you got to work with and then meet. Like that's what CCPA is a very good example. There were like a lot of gaps related to financial insurance. Like they were going after the Twitter, Facebook, Googles of the world, but like what is insurers? Insurers have to store medical information. A lot of claims PII. We got to store like 14 years, and there was one state that mandated us to store 99 years of data. I can't archive. But fortunately, storage is pennies to $1, right? On the cloud, I drop it in the cloud data lake. Like it's out there. If you want, like, oh, you want it like 99 years later when I'm all gone, go and take a look from the data lake. So you gotta like understand that document, whether it's like 100-page PDF or Word document. Understand that's where to start.
So reading, getting, like obviously that's, you know, these are sometimes you think it's intuitive, but continuing to do that, right? Like, so if you think about just advice to anybody that's trying to become a leader in this space, you can't lose track of that connection to the data and to the regulations. So you have to read them, you have to like really consume them. But one thing that I do personally is I still maintain logins to every one of the databases. I still keep, and I log in, I run queries, and like people think I'm crazy because I'll send them a query. Like, hey, I'm like, what are you doing in the database? I'm like, well, how am I supposed to have any conversation with you if I'm not looking at exactly what you're looking at? And obviously not as in depth, but as long as you carry that experience that you have, because we're constantly looking at new technologies, we have a ton of vendors out there. You have to understand it. You have to connect with them on something tangible, which is the physical logging in and understanding the systems and how they interact. But never lose that. Like find the time, block off the time to continue to log into these systems and to understand it hands-on. My biggest pain point is when I come across senior managers who have completely lost touch with what the organization is doing because they're spending time in PowerPoints or you know.
They've trusted the boxes and lines, and then it's
the boxes and lines. It's absolutely critical to log in and ask questions, right? And like continue to ask good questions and be inquisitive about these things and not just take them at face value. To your point, like understanding why the regulators are doing it, but also understand why your business is making certain decisions too. Just explain to me why you're doing this. Simple question, but it can unlock a lot of potential and you know, use your experience then to kind of repoint people into the right direction.
I was just going to add to say, I mean, if there are 3 key steps, right? I think he talked about one of them, understand the regulation itself. You know, with the regulation, what is the data requirements? Where's that data? What's the inventory of that data? And to a great extent, to Jesse's point, it's already, if there is critical reports and capabilities that are already there, you could actually leverage that to meet the requirements, you know, a much more easier way. So really devising a clear strategy of what are the quality requirements, what are the reporting requirements, and what is the actual retention requirements, to your point, and what kind of delivery do the regulations need, right? Do they need a report? Do they need an Excel spreadsheet? Do they need, what file? You know, so I think a lot of times there's so much time spent on, and where the data is, what have you. You think about all 3 of those things, and I think, if you're able to do that, to Jesse's point, there's a good chance that there's tons of reports and capabilities already there that you could actually leverage. And if there is, if it's already there, all you're doing is to meet the requirements, in a tactical way near term while you're building the foundation for a long term.
So just to paraphrase sort of what the three of you contributed to that question, which is great, is like, first, be an expert in the regulation. Don't trust the glossies, read the fine print. Become an expert on your own data. Don't trust that the data is what it says somewhere else. Use your whatever tools are at your disposal to stay in close touch with it, and then of course continue to be that educator and voice of reason to your business partners to say, here's what the regulator needs from us. Here's what we actually have. We might be closer than we think, or we might be further than we think, and we better sit down and talk about it. So being that sort of that, again, that connective tissue between the groups in the company. So those were all the questions I had for you today. So I want to take a moment to turn to Robert and of course to online to see. First, I'll ask, can we take a few minutes for questions, Robert?
There's a question. We've got about 101 attendees online sort of watching. So, but again, for our audience here and for our audience online, if you have got an additional question, please feel free to stick your hand up or put it in the Q&A. So this question came up for the panel. It says, could you provide any input about upcoming regulations that may impact organizations' value, the organization's ability to drive value?
One more time.
Yeah.
Any upcoming regulations?
Upcoming regulations that may impact value.
That may impact the organization's
I think
ability
you
to
mentioned one,
drive
Srini.
value.
With the state regulation. I don't know if there were others that maybe.
Oh yeah. So upcoming regulations
that could impact value of your data assets.
Exactly. Yeah. Like as I said, right. Like just last month, like one of the state put out entire data management pipeline that they want to regulate. Now, earlier, as I said, like insurers are on the hook for all the AI ML models. No, it's now like wherever data. So like, yeah, to your point, Ranjana and Jesse, right? Like, so now you got to understand the data. So for that, right? Like, so one advice I would give, right? Like, start with cataloging all your assets.
Right.
If you haven't already started, start now. Because a year or 2 years or 3 years later, if the regulations come in and ask for similar information, like you already have the catalog.
Ours is, right now we're working on, or prepping for, is a regulation from the SEC coming down that says we have to provide net of fee attribution to our clients, to our investment management clients. So, traditionally, from a performance reporting standpoint, you get a return that's accurate on a certain time period, multiple time periods. You have to do those regulations to control what was included in that return, and so we're transparent with our investment management clients on accuracy of the returns that we've created. But now, when you get into attribution, it starts to explain that return at a deeper level. You start to relate those things to benchmarks. Benchmarks have to align, and then when you layer in fees at an investment manager take on many forms. So now we're going to have to go back through, start to look at our transactions, both manager-directed and non-manager-directed fee impact to the returns, and then subsequently match those off to benchmarks. A lot of these tools that we use in this space have methodologies that are built in to the core of the application. We're going to have to go back in through all those things and modify code, or evaluate additional vendors to meet these requirements. So there's a lot of steps in just that one new regulation from the SEC that's caused us to really take a hard look all the way from transaction creation all the way through to end client reporting. So that's one that's ultimately will drive value back into our brand to show that our performance and our attribution of our investment managers is strong, but ultimately comes with a lot of overhead and could take away from other projects that we're doing.
And I'm presuming, Jesse, that'll be like you'll have to do a historic mass restatement, or is it a point in time going forward?
No, it's there's a sub period of time we have to go back, but not all the way back to inception. It's almost impossible with the the fact that just securities mature and disappear off the face of the earth, right? So, you know, there's those types of things where we're going to have to, no, it's limited. So
That's still a lot of work.
Still a challenge, yeah.
Ranjana?
I was just going to see if there's other questions.
Oh, okay, yeah, good point.
No,
Take one or two more, yeah. Well, actually, but I want to be, for the folks who actually took the time to come out, are there any questions in the room? Just throw up a hand. Please.
Ben.
So one of the patterns I often see in these regulated industries, right, is almost like a blanket approach. So you have some data that's highly regulated, and then other data that's not, then also gets just as locked down. So you're sort of tampering data curiosity and self-exploration. So how do you balance that? You want to be responsible, but then make sure it doesn't like become this sort of everything needs to get so locked down that no one can look at it.
So Ben, I'll give you, it's nice to see you, Ben, after a long time. I know we worked together many, many years ago. I will say one of the key ways we've been able to do that is by tagging the information. I think that was it was just a phenomenal tool to say, hey, these are the data attributes that are tied to AML regulation, the CCAR regulation, the Basel regulation, GDPR, CCPA. The tagging really helped us unlock the data that wasn't, required to be locked down, right? So it really gave a lot of transparency to our chief privacy and risk officers, where they were not hounding on the business leaders to leverage that information. It actually made a huge difference to bring both the leaders together, but also having the ability to provide that transparency, if you may. So that's one tool that I have leveraged very extensively to make sure that we could unlock the data.
Yeah, as I said, right, like the cataloging. So we now have phenomenal capabilities available using AI and ML to automate the metadata and cataloging. That's why I said, like, if you haven't started, like, start now. So they are tagging, like now use the AI and ML for tagging. So
Yeah, even that requires approval to unlock just to do the tagging.
Yeah.
So
Good point.
Yeah.
Great question. Thank you. Any others in the room before we go back to the phones?
Well, Danny, just in the last couple of minutes, it just might be worthwhile to ask you and the panelists if there was one thing that you can point to that sort of proved the value that you've been able to drive to it. In your opinion, what is that one thing that you said, you've, above everything else, start here, this has provided the most benefit to driving value with regulations? What would that be just in the last couple of minutes?
We'll do our lightning round here. So the one thing that helped drive value in the regulated industry.
Technology. So look, you gotta stay abreast on technology, and you have to push. Those are the areas, like all the other things aside, right? Like obviously there's a lot of communication, there's a lot of understanding what the regulations are, but stay up on the latest technology, because it will make the process smoother, and it will enhance your ability to do things quicker. If you have better tools. That's just from experience. We have a lot of legacy approaches to managing data. So I'd say start at the baseline.
I'll say know your data, right? Know your data. Where is it? What do you have? What do you not have? What are the gaps? And what can you acquire? That'll be a big, big win. I don't know how many times I've heard we just really don't know where this information is. So know your data and know what you have and what you don't have.
And I guess technology can actually help with that as well.
So I will double down on that, right? Like it's the data asset catalog. To know your data, technology, phenomenal capabilities are available now. So data asset catalog, because the regulated industry has a very large tie-in with the data governance, right? And I consider the foundation for data governance is the data asset catalog.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Well, what I'd say is, so just to summarize, leverage the technology, leverage your own knowledge as data practitioners to know your data, right? And also make sure that you get to cataloging early, because then you'll know what's there. That becomes the persistent knowledge of the enterprise too. Robert, I will say I want to thank you for letting this panel humor you
and our audience here for an hour.
You forgot to mention the most important part.
What's that?
None of this can be done without the help of professional services folks like
You're too
Caserta,
kind.
who can actually help deliver, implement, and find the data. You're missing the whole.
Thank you. I was not here to plug, but I appreciate that.
I am for you. You know, Danny, I appreciate it. But,
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Hey, thanks for making my job so easy. This is an underhand moderator job with 3 pros like this. So thanks very much, everybody.
Great.
Thank you.
Danny, thank you indeed.
Thank you.